is beginning now. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. How grateful we are to study Torah together. We're going to continue to progress sequentially through the Mishnayot, the teachings of Pirkei Avot, chapter 4. I will bring on screen the text that we completed last time, which directly leads us to the next set of texts. And we'll get through a bunch of these today because some of these are pretty short and straightforward. So we're looking here at the Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi. So this fellow right here, Rabbi Ishmael, his son, meaning Rabbi Yossi, the speaker in the previous Mishnah. Rabbi Ishmael beno Omer, Rabbi Ishmael, his son, said, "He who refrains from judgment rids himself of enmity, robbery, and false swearing." We covered that last time. So if you haven't yet watched the YouTube recording of the class, if you were not able to be with us last week, you could go back and watch that. But this is kind of a list, a twofold, three-way list of the risks that might be associated with the role of judge, which was one of the two mandated functions of the classical rabbinate. And so we talked about that at quite some length at the last part of our class a week ago. And then he whose heart is presumptuous in giving a judicial decision is foolish, wicked, and arrogant. So there seems to be an open acknowledgement before we get into a longer discussion of the function of rabbi as judge, that this is serious business with considerable risks associated with being a judge of other people, a judge on behalf of the Jewish tradition, and a judge for a community. Nevertheless, it is one of the things that rabbis were called by their communities to do. And it's a particularly mosaic function too. One of the things I may not have highlighted last week because it didn't come to me until after the class was over, is that it seems to me that a case could be made that the rabbis who envision themselves as, on the one hand, teachers of Torah, and on the other hand, judges of people and the community in light of Jewish law and practice, are actually the two primary functions established by the original rabbi, the OG rabbi, Moses, who is known in rabbinic tradition as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our rabbi, Moses, our teacher, or Moses, our judge, right? So you, of course, I think everybody who has even a passing familiarity with the character of Moses in the Torah knows that he's a teacher of Torah. Less prominent may be his role in judging the community, though it comes up several times in the Torah, most famously in Exodus chapter 18, where he has to receive a little bit of loving, if firm, mentorship from his father-in-law Jethro, who was also a religious leader, the priest of Midian, whose daughter Tzipporah becomes Moses's wife. And it is Jethro, Moses's father-in-law, who observed Moses in front of his community from dawn until dusk, adjudicating matters great and small. And Jethro, his loving father-in-law, takes him aside and says two wonderful words in Hebrew. He says, Nabol tibol, you will surely wear yourself out. In other words, if you, Moses, have to be the judge of, everything from a murder case to is my chicken kosher, then you're not going to be a very effective rabbi for the community. Instead, his father-in-law advises him, you should appoint ministers of different levels to manage the population, and so that only the highest and most deserving high-level cases come to you. Moses should be like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not a smaller local or circuit court player. But it does suggest to me that the archetype of teacher-judge in the role of Rabbeinu, in the role of our rabbi, is Moses, which takes you all the way back, if you will recall, to the very first word of Pirkei Avot. which is Moses received Torah at Sinai, right? You go all the way back to Pirkei Avot 1:1. I believe the first word of Pirkei Avot is Moshe. Now I'm gonna check my volume to see if memory serves me correctly. Moshe, yeah, the first Pirkei Avot 1:1. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received Torah at Sinai, and everything stems from that, right? And so we've talked about Pirkei Avot as the rabbinic handbook of masters to their disciples, teaching rabbis how to be rabbis. Now think back to the fact that it is a deliberate literary choice for Pirkei Avot to start with the name Moses, because it is Moses who is the archetype of all of the things that are taught in Pirkei Avot, either directly or obliquely. That's sort of where I wanted to go. It was an insight that came to me only after we concluded our class last week, but I wanted to share it with you. So moving on to where we begin this week. He, and again, we're still same rabbi, so Yishmael ben Yossi, Ishmael son of Yossi, used to say, judge not alone, al tihi dan yichidi. Even more idiomatically, or more literally, the translation is, don't be a judge by yourself. Okay, don't try and do this work alone. For none may judge alone save one. And maybe they should have capitalized one, though I think the ambiguity there is delicious. She'ein dan yichidi ela echad. For none may judge by oneself, ela echad, the one, meaning God, the ultimate judge. Now, it is true that the Torah views it as permissible for a certain learned person, at least in the way the rabbis understand the Torah. The rabbis understand that a certain very learned, very experienced person can be a sole judge for cases. Nevertheless, the norm in much of Jewish life is not one, but rather a multiple. And we'll talk about what that multiple is. The second part of the Mishnah here is, Va'al tomar kablu dati. Do not say, quote, accept my view. Like, you must accept my opinion. Shehen rasha'in velo ata. For they are free, but not you. Well, that's a weird line that I want to come back to. So we'll revisit that. But first, what I want to do is bring on screen a secondary text which talks about the role of judge. So what we're going to look at is Mishnah from Tractate Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, which is all about court process. So let's, based on the rabbinic or the pre-rabbinic court that is said to have stood during temple times. So we're looking at Mishna Sanhedrin, chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. Cases of monetary law are adjudicated by 3. So in other words, laws that have to do with sums of money in any way, shape, or form, including as a penalty exacted for some other crime, anything that involves money, as opposed to, for instance, capital or corporal crime. But cases of monetary law are adjudicated by 3. They are chosen in the following manner. This litigant, meaning litigant A, chooses one for himself, chooses a judge, a rabbi. And that litigant, litigant B, chooses one for himself. And then the two of them choose one more for themselves together. So one rabbi is provided by litigant A, one rabbi by litigant B, and the two of them have to collaborate to agree upon rabbi number 3. And then you have a duly constituted Beit Din, a rabbinical court. So matters of significance in Jewish law are not to be adjudicated by a single judge, even though it is later deemed to be permissible under rabbinic practice, but rather the standard is 3. This is according to Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say, so that's one opinion. The rabbis, meaning the kind of, this might be the majority view against Rabbi Meir, say, or clarifying Rabbi Meir. The 2 judges that were chosen, choose one more judge for themselves. So the difference is that litigant A chooses a judge, litigant B chooses his rabbi or her rabbi as the second judge, and then those two judges pick the third. One litigant, litigant A, can disqualify the judge chosen by that litigant, litigant B, and litigant B can disqualify the judge chosen by litigant A. So you can actually veto the rabbi. He said, "Nah, I don't like that rabbi. I'm not going to allow him," according to Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say, when can one of the litigants disqualify the judges? You remember, this is not Pirkei Avot. This is like hardcore Mishnah here. It gets considerably convoluted. So the rabbis want to know more about this. When, under what circumstances can one of the litigants disqualify another judge? Only when he, meaning the litigant, brings evidence about them, meaning the judge or rabbi or rabbis, that they are related to one of the litigants or to each other, or that they are disqualified from serving as judges for another reason. So disqualifying factors would be that one should recuse oneself by reason of having a vested interest, by being related to related to one of the litigants and therefore could not be unbiased, or that there's some other disqualifying feature. But if they are fit, and I believe the word for fit here is kosher, I'm looking for it. Yep. I'm looking for it. Don't see it. I'll have to go and read more closely. Oh, there it is. Shehayu ksherim. There's the word. So if they are kosher to judge, if they are fit to serve as judges or are experts ordained by the court, he, meaning either of the litigants, cannot disqualify them. This litigant can disqualify the witnesses of the other litigant, and that litigant can disqualify the witnesses of that litigant. Okay, and it goes on from there. The bigger point is that there's broad agreement that the number of rabbi judges for a given court case pertaining to a matter of law, Jewish law, of course, halakha, is 3, not 1. We have a judge with us today, Carol Levy. You served as a judge, correct?
Yes.
Well, what do you think about all of this? I imagine you're reading this with a particular, a deeply invested lens.
I had cases where they were trying to amend, I guess, or modify a Beit Din. And there were two very orthodox lawyers who would do it just like a Talmudic discussion on this hand, and then, but on the other one say, but on the other hand, he's correct, but on the other hand, and this goes back and forth. And afterwards, one of the lawyers came up and said, I have to tell you, you may not understand how this goes. So they are aware that it's one judge, but they can always appeal the one judge, whereas you can't appeal a Beit Din, can you?
To my knowledge, you cannot appeal a Beit Din, but you can move to disqualify one of the participants in the Beit Din and have him. It would always be him in an Orthodox setting replaced.
Right, but
wow.
It's quite different. So I'm quite amused.
Good. I'm glad. I could sense a little bit of amusement on your face, and I'm grateful for your sharing. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment here? I mean, generally in my world, I work at a synagogue, as I often remind others, where reform is our middle name. So, in my world, the only time I am involved in matters for a Beit Din are really two. One, directly as a participant in a Beit Din for the purpose of conversion to Judaism. It is still a norm in all parts of the Jewish world, though I'm going to qualify this statement, that membership in the Jewish people is adjudicated by a panel of 3, not 1. However, if you are the community rabbi of the Reformed Jewish Shtibel in Boise, you may have a hard time convening a Beit Din. So many of my Reform colleagues in areas where coming up with 3 rabbis is actually not often attainable will solemnize conversions as the sole judge. Again, if you're converting under Reform auspices to begin with, you should be duly forewarned that your conversion has legitimacy only within the Reform world. And I do provide that disclaimer to anyone who converts with me or any of my in-house WRT Reform colleagues. Beginning a handful of years ago, not all that many years ago, 3 or 4, after several years of working and conversing about this matter with my cantorial colleagues, especially Cantor Kleinman, I and we together as partners made the decision to include the cantors of WRT on Beit Din, on Beit Dins, on our courts. So when we convert at WRT, you may have a cantor on your Beit Din, and we will advise the candidate for conversion of that in at least at WRT, cantors and rabbis have different qualifications leading to our respective ordinations, but I do not believe that one is less or more qualified than the other to judge the suitability of a candidate for conversion. And again, everybody has to understand that if they would rather convert under conservative or Orthodox auspices for the benefit of having a broader range of places within the Jewish community globally where they will be accepted as Jewish, they certainly are welcome to do so, and it would be my privilege and pleasure to help connect them to an Orthodox or a conservative Beit Din. The other place in which I'm involved in the work of Beit Din is not directly, but when a divorcing couple presents themselves to me in the interest of acquiring a get. For the purpose of get, which is a writ of divorce, that makes it possible for both parties to remarry, but especially for the woman to remarry without the threat of future children from a future marriage being deemed illegitimate, mamzer. A mamzer, you probably know mamzer, is from the Hebrew mamzer, which means bastard or illegitimate child. And any child, technically, according to the Orthodox understanding of Jewish law, who was born to a woman who did not get a get from her first marriage that resulted in divorce is illegitimate, because technically, if the ketubah has not been annulled through the issuance of a get, the woman is still married to her first husband. So that's a problem. So on the occasions, and this does happen a couple times a year, somebody might request information about how to get a get. I usually direct them to an organization that compassionately, humanely, and for not a whole lot of shekels will make it possible for them to be paired with an Orthodox Beit Din, a panel of 3 Orthodox rabbis who will issue a get. Once in a very blue moon, you have a husband who refuses to give the get to his wife, thereby annulling or ending the marriage. In such cases, a Beit Din can be convened for the specific purpose of compelling, exacting duress on the recalcitrant husband to issue the get. So Beit Dins do, so that happened to me once, where I was involved peripherally because a member of our congregation was one of the parties in the marriage that had gone bad. And I was asked to advise on how to connect with a get, connect with a Beit Din that would compel the recalcitrant ex-husband to give a get, which eventually, under much pressure, he did. Generally, okay, so that's generally the way in which Beit Din functions in my corner of the world, and generally in the Reform, conservative, and modern Orthodox world. Beit Din probably has more day-to-day function in the ultra-Orthodox world, about which I really don't know much, to be honest. All right, any comments, questions here? We've only gotten through one line of Pirkei Avot, but it's a way of saying one judge is not sufficient. 3 is the magic number, according to elsewhere in the Mishnah. So let's bring back on screen where we left off. And we have this really interesting text. So I'll just recap it for you, and then I'll show you the text. the first piece is do not judge alone, for none may judge alone save one, presumably a reference to the one we call echad, right? The one. The second statement, though, is really interesting about they are, do not say, kablu dati, do not say in adjudicating a case, in your role as judge, as rabbi, do not say kablu dati, you should accept my opinion. Just kind of like an imperative, right? You must accept my opinion. Shehein rasha'in velo ata, for they are free, which is not the best response. It is more to the point that they have permission and you do not. Anyone want to venture a guess at what is being said here? Again, the command is simple enough. One may not use force or even verbal force to get a litigant or perhaps the other judges to acquiesce to one's view, for they are free, but not you. I suspect that this is more about one's fellow judges, and there's a lot being implied here. Elliptically, what's being suggested is you are not a judge alone, and therefore, as a judge, saying to your colleagues on the Beit Din, kablu dati, take my view, is not the way that you work collaboratively with your partners. But I'm curious to hear if anyone else had any views on this. I'll bring the text on screen just so that y'all can see what we're talking about here. In the meantime, if you just want to unmute yourself, if you have a comment or a question, please feel free to do so. I'm looking at the other tab right now.
Okay. What comes to mind, of course, and perhaps it doesn't relate at all, is the technique that Governor Cuomo applied when he said, you can have your own opinions, but you cannot have your own facts. And
right.
Maybe there is no connection whatsoever. Probably not, because there's probably one thing that he never studied is the Mishnah.
Okay.
It is still something that reverberates, if you wish, in my recollection.
Thank you. I like that very much. And I would say, yes, I think that part of what's embedded here is the fact that it is just an opinion. It is also just one person's opinion, as opposed to the function of a Beit Din is to provide a means by which one rabbi's opinion will be insufficient to carry a court case. Right? So do not say, accept my view. Do not exert pressure on your, I think it's rabbinic colleagues, that your opinion matters more than theirs, for they are free, but not you. Anyone want to venture what that's talking about there? It's a very curious phrase that deserves to be unpacked, but isn't. Well, let me ask you this. In a Beit Din, assuming 3, where does the power reside? I saw Judy's hand went up, the other Judy Lass. Do you want to unmute yourself? Because I saw your fingers do something meaningful.
Yeah, they probably did do something by mistake. Yeah, because I guess that 2 against 1 is a majority.
There it is, right? Yeah, exactly. I saw your fingers, and I think you signaled the number 2, and that's the whole point here, right? That you can't exert that kind of pressure on your colleagues, because at the end of the day, on a judging panel of 3, the other 2 have more weight than you do, or any grouping of 2. Audrey Stoyer and then Russell, please. Thank you, Judy.
Okay, I was wondering if anybody had overbearing power, it would be the judge who was selected by the other 2 judges.
Oh, that's interesting, right?
He might be the most neutral, perhaps.
Thank you. And it's interesting, you know, the Mishnah doesn't internally agree on exactly how the judges are selected. The Talmud will later unpack this, but all of this is purely speculative, right? This is drawing on norms from Jewish life that were actually not known to the rabbis who were writing about them. And so they were probably retrojecting back onto some ancient tradition what might have been customary in their own time centuries later. Thanks, Audrey. Russell.
Well, this may be an anachronistic interpretation, but I read it to mean that you don't coerce, you persuade your fellow judges. Don't say, listen to me because I'm right. You have to find another way. And that to me would seem to be persuasion.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think it's anachronistic. I think it's a Jewish norm that is encoded into our practice and our teachings at a very early stage in the development of those practices and teachings. So I appreciate that very much. At least that's what I'd like to believe, that the rabbis understand that they are not just training individuals to be sole charismatic leaders of communities. They are teaching rabbis to collaborate to lead communities, and that's very different. So the person sitting next to you in yeshiva may well be your partner on a Beit Din. But what's also interesting here is that it's not a sitting court, right? It's not like three are selected and then like the Supreme Court, they sit for a long term till they're elected again, or in the case of the Supreme Court, presumably for the rest of their lives or until they choose to step down. It doesn't work that way. It's case by case. Each case convenes its own Beit Din. All right, so that's just a little bit on the function of rabbi as judge. Let's read forward and see what more there is to uncover. I think we will come back to judging. Not much is said about this because we're now back to more comments, which I think are fairly simple to unpack, about the matrix in a rabbi's engagements between Torah on the one hand, the study, teaching, learning, and practice of Torah, and material pursuit on the other. And this seems to be a through line for much of Pirkei Avot, especially chapters 3 and 4. Rabbi Jonathan, I like this guy's name. Rabbi Yonatan, that's my Hebrew name, not my given Hebrew name. That's the Hebrew name I go by when I'm in Israel. My given Hebrew name is Moshe, for my late grandfather, Morris or Mo Blake, of blessed memory. But when I'm in Israel, I generally just say, call me Yoni, Yonatan, or Yoni, Johnny. But all Israelis prefer nicknames to even heads of state, as you know. Nobody ever calls him Binyamin Netanyahu. It's always Bibi. All right, Yonatan. Yonatan ben Yosef was a devoted student of Rabbi Yishmael, however, later also influenced by the approach of Rabbi Akiva from the last of the 5 generations of the early teachers of Mishnah, circa 135 to 170. That's the generation, not his dates of birth and presumed death. So he's associated with the generation of those teachers post Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba's failed revolt was 135 CE. So Rabbi Jonathan says, Kol hamikayem et haTorah me'oni, anyone who is upholding the Torah in a state of poverty, or here it says out of a state of poverty. So if you are not a wealthy person, but you are engaged in the study and practice of Torah, Sofo l'kayamach me'osher, in the end will uphold it, meaning Torah, from a state of wealth. And we're going to talk about what is being promised here. Is it a promise? Is it a direction or an instruction? Does it mean literally what it appears to mean? Or is there another, perhaps more allegorical way of understanding it? We'll talk about all of that. So again, just to recap, anyone who fulfills the Torah out of a state of poverty, in the end, that person will fulfill it in wealth. And v'chol hamivatel et haTorah me'osher, anyone who negates Torah, here they say discards Torah, which is a very nice word. Anyone who, literally the word mivatel, this verb here, means to cancel, spurn, negate, discard is a fine word for mivatel. Anyone who discards the Torah me'osher, in a state of wealth or out of a state of wealth, sofo levatla me'oni, will in the end come to have discarded it in poverty. Okay, this is a fun one. What do you make of it? have you seen it up on the screen long enough? I can take it off the screen at this point. Just take one more look at it just so you're seeing it. Whoever fulfills the Torah out of a state of poverty, in the end will be able to, his end will be to fulfill it out of a state of wealth. And if you discard Torah out of a state of wealth, the end will be to discard it out of a state of poverty. Somebody want to venture just your own interpretation? Michelle Braun writes, when you are rich, they think you really know, Tevya. That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for that. Karen Levin, please.
I don't think they're talking about financial wealth. They're not talking about money or acquisitions other than what you're gaining spiritually, that your spiritual self will have more wealth. I mean, plenty of people study Torah when they're financially poor, and yet they have a very beautiful soul and a beautiful spiritual continence of them.
Great. Okay. So yeah, empirically speaking, Karen is quite right? One can just observe looking around that the Mishnah is not literally true. We often see people who study Torah and who do not become rich. And we often see people who do not study Torah and do not become poor. And so when you look at the later commentaries on this Mishnah, it is often interpreted to mean that anyone who studies the Torah out of poverty will continue to study the Torah or continue to keep the Torah even if that person becomes wealthy. It's very interesting. This is one line of interpretation. And anyone who does not study the Torah when wealthy will not study it even if he becomes poor. In other words, we should not assume that a person's Torah study or lack of Torah study, Torah living or lack of Torah living, has anything to do with one's economic status. But the other interpretation is the one that I think you've given us, which is that wealth is not to be taken literally. Rather, wealth or poverty refer in this Mishnah to the type of wealth that's mentioned actually in Mishnah 1 of chapter 4. If you recall, just 2 weeks ago, or 3, I guess with Thanksgiving, it might have been 3 or 4 weeks ago, this chapter of Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, defines for us what wealth actually is. Remember, who is rich? One who is satisfied with his portion, right? So we're actually possibly talking about spiritual wealth. So 2 possible interpreted lines here. One, the one Karen lifted up for us, is that wealth and poverty are not economic designators of economic status, but rather a spiritual wealth, spiritual poverty. And secondly, that perhaps this is an indicator that in the real world, how rich one is and how poor one is does not really appear to have much of a bearing on how one approaches Torah for study or practice. Any other comments on this Mishnah, which I find, lovely and this is very like vintage Pirkei Avot. It's just very Pirkei Avot-esque, the way it's written, the mnemonic design of it for easy memorization, and yet another caution to the young yeshiva bocher training for a life of Torah, that one should not get caught up in the trappings of material gain at the expense of the pursuit of Torah. That dialectic between spiritual pursuit and material pursuit is, again, prominently on display in this Mishnah. And at this point, I probably don't need to unpack it more because we've explored this dialectic substantially in previous week's learnings. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look again at our text. I'll bring it. I just have to enlarge it a little bit. Sorry, I'm flip-flopping between windows, which sometimes makes my life a little bit complicated on Zoom. But it is nice not to have to print out run off printouts. Here we go. Rabbi Meir said, who is Rabbi Meir? Well, he's very prominent among the Mishnaic sages. Remember, I can click on his name and go to the sidebar. Also from the generation of the previous teacher, Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi Yonatan. Rabbi Meir was an unusual but prolific scholar who studied under Elisha ben Abuya, as well as Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. You'll recall that Elisha ben Abuya is the one who is not to be named or is given the sinister moniker, the other, acher. who becomes an apostate Jew. He leaves the Jewish tradition, which was beautifully novelized by Milton Steinberg in his wonderful book, As a Driven Leaf, which again, if you're looking for winter reading, pick up As a Driven Leaf. It's so good. He later became the head of the court in Usha until he quarreled with Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and at that point he left Palestine altogether, also known to have experienced many miracles. So Rabbi Meir comes up a lot in the Agadah, in the lore of rabbinic literature. Rabbi Meir Omer, he says, Hevei mima'et ba'esek, engage only a little, engage but little in business. You can see we're on the same theme here. Va'asok ba'torah, and presumably instead, busy yourself with the Torah, or in contrast, busy yourself with the Torah. And you notice, just as a fun aside here, the word that is used, the verb that is used with Torah is the same word with which we bless God for the study of Torah. We don't say to read Torah, we don't say to study Torah, we say la'asok b'divrei Torah. I always say to immerse ourselves, but the word comes from this root here, asok, ayin samech kuf, which has to do with your business. Make Torah your business. But it's a beautiful contrast to the word that came before it, which is asek, which generally means like your business in the sense of where you go to get paid to do a job. So hevei mima'et, only do a little the asek of business, va'asok ba'torah, and make Torah your business in the other sense of business. It's really lovely. Just the literary dimension of this is so important to pay attention to. And then it goes on to say, be of humble spirit before all men. I would say all people. Vehevei shefal ruach, literally of a downcast spirit, but humble is the better idiomatic translation. Be humble, bifnei chol adam, in front of any person, in front of all people. V'im batalta min haTorah, if you have neglected the Torah, there's that same word again. It was mivatalan, I think, or mivatala in the last one, same root. If you have spurned, discarded, neglected, here they translate just fine. Canceled is another way of, if you have spurned the Torah, yesh lecha v'telim harbe kenegdach. Many will, here's how they translate. If you have neglected the Torah, you shall have many who bring you to neglect it. Yesh lecha betelim harbe kenegdecha. We're going to unpack that sentence too. There will be many who neglect, literally, it's like I'm struggling to translate here. Yesh lecha betelim, you have many negators.
Excuses
in front of you.
Jonathan,
Maybe excuses.
That's not my translation. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not an interruption. It's a meaningful addition, right? If you have spurned Torah, you will have many possibly excuses to keep on neglecting Torah. We'll go back to that. It's a cryptic phrase. V'im amalta v'Torah, but if you have really toiled with Torah, amal means to exert yourself. So if you've really exerted yourself in the direction of Torah, yesh lo sachar harbe liten lach, you will have great reward to be given unto you. Okay, the case is quite straightforward, right? In the balance of how a person, or rabbi especially, should balance his life, a little business in order to put food on the table, perhaps, but your main business is Torah. Be humble in front of every person. We should talk about what that means. And then 2 notes, one a caution, one a promise. If you neglect Torah, there will be many who come before you to neglect. And if you toil in Torah, your reward will be great. Thoughts on this one? Thoughts or comments? Ivan, your hand is up. So if you would like to share, just unmute yourself, please.
All right. Well, let me go back. So the Mishnah at the very beginning, we talked about the fact that, in a sense, the rabbis got together and replaced the fallen temple and a way of communicate to each other. Now we get to the point where Jews are dispersed virtually everywhere. How did this teaching get to the Jews dispersed, yet are still being encouraged to live the life of Torah. This is really interesting to me, because at some point, orthodoxy appears everywhere, whether it was Germany or England, or in the invitation of the King of Poland. But I'm still thinking in terms of who are they talking to? Naturally, they're talking to each other, and they form opinion and counter opinions. But there is a mass, I don't know how many thousands of Jews get at some point that kind of wisdom, or that kind of command, or that kind of knowledge. Exile.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I don't know. What I can suggest is that there's some evidence coming from the text itself that Judaism and the practice of Judaism within Jewish communities has always been much more of a mixed bag than perhaps the officially designated exponents of the Jewish tradition are willing to admit. Like even in Orthodoxy, even in an Orthodox Jewish community, it's clear that there are different levels and degrees of engagement with Torah, right? So even from the earliest strata of Jewish history and Jewish law, you have evidence from a text like this that you've got people who are deeply engaged in the life of Torah, and you have other people who would much rather be, focused on their business affairs. And obviously there's a judgment, a negative judgment against those who are more concerned with day-to-day business than Torah business. But that's in large measure because of who's writing this text. So there's obviously a definitive view of what's right and what's wrong here, but I'm more interested from an anthropological lens in exploring just what I think you're indicating, which is that, well, it's always been a bit of a mixed bag. You've always had Jews in Jewish communities, even in nominally Orthodox communities, that are, they call themselves Orthodox, but are they really spending the time in Torah study that some people in our Reform community are? I don't know. I'd like to, my dad has a comment, so you can unmute.
Do you think you could put the text back up for a minute?
Happily, of course. Here we are.
The thing that's puzzling me is the sense that there is the outside world that acts on the subject here. These aren't revelations you come to by yourself. For instance, if you have neglected the Torah, you shall have many who shall bring you to neglect it. This suggests an outside agency. And if you study Torah, there is much reward to give unto you. Again, it suggests an outside agency. So I'm wondering if this is connected to the be humble of spirit before all men, and this is the way in which other people will regard you.
Oh, that's really nice. I've been seeking and not finding a possible connection between this phrase, be of humble spirit before all people, all men, and what either comes before it or what comes after it. I mean, it seems to me a discordant phrase. It doesn't seem to function as a particularly compelling conjunction. And perhaps, do you want to just say one sentence more about how you see a possible connection there? You phrased it as a question, but let's just make it a statement because it's a good one.
Okay, if you neglect the Torah, you would think that the way in which this would be phrased is that, or I guess, as Karen said before, you'll have plenty of excuses. This suggests something maybe that's not really there in the text to me. It suggests that other people will come to you and agree with you, neglect the Torah. And if you study Torah, there will be others who will come to you and give you your regards. And this will happen to you if you do what Rabbi Meir says.
That's lovely. Just lovely. That's great. Thank you for being our teacher. It's great.
Toda rabba.
Bavakasha. All right, well, since I have the screen up, I'm going to go to the next one. Rabbi Eliezer Benjakov. Okay, so this is great, and we actually get into a little bit of legal terminology, and I'm going to look at some of our lawyers for a little bit of assistance here. I tried to do a little bit of homework yesterday just to be ready for this, but I'm definitely out of my depth on some legal terminology here. What I'm good at is etymology, so you'll help me. Rabbi Eliezer Benjakov says, Ha'oseh mitzvah achat. See how easy it is to learn Mishnah? That's easy Hebrew. Ha'oseh mitzvah achat. 3 words that we all know. One who does a single mitzvah, one who does one commandment. Koneh lo praklit echad. You acquire yourself a praklit. Now here they say an advocate, but we're going to look into that word praklit. That's a very weird word. If Jane Roberts is with us today, she knows that that is not a normal, and I think Jane Roberts is with us today. She knows that is not a normal word. That is not a Semitic root, praklit. It's got a pei, it's got a resh, it's got a kuf, it's got a lamed, forget the yud, and it's got a tet at the end. That is not the way Hebrew words are normally formed, and nor does it sound like a Hebrew word for those of us who speak some Hebrew, praklit. Okay, so what is a praklit? We'll find out. Here they say an advocate. And ha'over avera achat, one who commits one transgression, literally one who transgresses one transgression, konele kategor echad, another word that's not indigenous to Hebrew, acquires a kategor. Both of these are Greek loan words. So if you obey a single mitzvah, you acquire an advocate or a praklit. If you transgress a single transgression, you acquire an accuser, a kategor. So a praklit and a kategor are the words in front of us. And what I'd like to do is bring up some fun chokhmah that I found on both of these words. So the first comes from an article that was published in Haaretz about 9 years ago, and then updated in 2018, that I will show you from Haaretz, which is one of Israel's preeminent newspapers, where I have a subscription, so I was able to get this article, though it may be publicly available, from their column called Word of the Day. And it even says, while there are plenty of lawyers in Israel, only a handful can call themselves praklitim. So I'd like to read this article. Almost 10,000 law school graduates take the Israeli bar exam every year. The pass rate stands at about 70%, which is enough to make quite a few Jewish mothers happy. Once certified, these new professionals join the tens of thousands of fellow members of the bar who are able to make a living as, in Hebrew, orchei din, lawyers, or literally practitioners of the law. While most of them make do with this title, a few don the more ancient appellation praklitim, the masculine plural for praklit. Originally applying to every man and woman in the legal profession, in common parlance, praklit has become associated with those working for the different branches of praklitut hamedina, the state prosecution, also known simply as hapraklitut, or the prosecution. It is currently headed by Praklit HaMedina, the state prosecutor, who at the time was Moshe Lador. An early adoption of the Greek paraklitos, meaning advocate, Praklit appears in the English translation of the New Testament as the Comforter in John 14, a moniker for the Holy Spirit. And indeed, a handful, if not more, of state prosecution's employees see themselves as martyrs, struggling against all odds to defend Israel's crumbling rule of law. You can see this is a bit of an editorial too. It is better, however, to be driven by ideology than by money, which was one of the main themes in the 1980s legal drama LA Law, known in Israel as Praklitei LA. So if you go to Netflix in Israel and want to look up old episodes of LA Law, you look up Praklitei LA. And although Israelis love to argue, often for the sake of the argument, the expression Praklit HaSatan, or the devil's advocate, is not commonly used in modern Hebrew, maybe due to its Christian origins. But even in the Jewish state, lawyers have to deal with some devilish characters, either their colleagues or clients, or both. And that's the article on Praklit. So it is a legal term that refers to a particular kind of legal advocate. And I wonder if anyone who may have some grounding in the legal tradition can say anything more about the role of, or the role of the terminology of advocate, even if you're not familiar with Praklit before today, as it functions in the legal profession. Like, what is the purpose of an advocate? What does this name imply, either in English, in Hebrew, or in Greek?
Is this like a district attorney?
I have a feeling that that's what's being described when they talk about the state's prosecutor. The state's prosecutor, it could be a district, it could be like the U.S. attorney. I remember that when I was serving on a federal grand jury 7 or 8 years ago, the ones who were presenting the case in the hopes of securing a true bill or securing an indictment so that the case could be brought to trial were U.S. attorneys, right? They were attorneys representing the United States government against alleged criminals, drug lords, people who were implicated in federal bank robbery, things like that, things that would go before a grand jury. So that was my interaction with the U.S. attorneys, which I think would fit the definition here of Praklit.
Prosecutors rather than defendants' lawyers.
As I understand it, correct. Now, in this case, of course, the way in which one acquires a Praklit is by performing a single mitzvah. So this is interesting. Like, what is meant by this? To perform a single mitzvah, one acquires a Praklit. I don't know, Russell, I'm looking to you for some guidance here. Do you have anything to offer?
Well, I'm flattered that you think that I would. I can think of two things, and I'm sort of wrestling, both of them sort of metaphorical. If you perform a mitzvah, the person who benefits from it naturally becomes your advocate. But I also think it has a spiritual implication that I'm reminded that a mitzvah is a law. It's not just a good thing to do. It is a law, and by doing it, whatever moral or spiritual demons you wrestle with, you now have an advocate on your side in a metaphorical sense.
Thank you. And I think that this would not be the first time that I have invited us to pay attention to the rabbinic view, prominent throughout rabbinic literature and especially prominent in Pirkei Avot, that court is a meaningful framework, not only for understanding what rabbis do in the world, but also the spiritual enterprise of life, and especially what happens after we die. The idea that at the end of our time on earth, what awaits us next is a trial, is a court hearing. And that, at least in the rabbinic view, you may not agree with this. I certainly don't agree with it in a literal way. But we say in our poetic way when we read from our High Holy Day Machzor in the Reform movement, and we talk about, you record and you recount, the book of life contains a record of all of our deeds, and what is written there speaks for itself, right? Like, it is our deeds that provide that which will either advocate for us or accuse against us in the Olam Haba. The next phase of our existence, our post-earthly existence, is a court trial. And therefore, the performance of the mitzvah itself is actually the a priori evidence of how we lived, and therefore either advocates for us or, in the case of transgression, accuses against us, right? So just something to think about. That the image of the court was, of course, part of the rabbinic structure for their work in the world, but it was also, from a spiritual perspective, how they envisioned what awaited us after our time on earth was done. Just looking back at the text now. Oh no, I said we have another fun etymology thing. So I did a little bit of just Googling around for the other word for accuser, which is Kategor. Another Greek loanword, as is explicitly mentioned here. We didn't have a kind of a fun article from Haaretz on Word of the Day for Kategor, but I'll read what we have here. This is a wonderful site, balashon.com, which literally means in the language. It's the Hebrew language search engine, or Hebrew language detective, which does kind of deep work into Hebrew terms. Kategor. As we mentioned earlier, Kategor is a Talmudic term for accuser or prosecutors. Now, it was interesting, we likened the Praklit to the prosecutor in the case of trying the state's case, but let's leave that aside. Kategor appears as the opposite of Praklit in Avot 4:13. I was so happy to see that reference. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what we're studying today. And as the opposite of a different word, Sanegor, in Babylonian Talmud Tractate Rosh Hashanah 26a. Its verbal form, meaning to accuse or denounce, is kitareg, kuf talit resh gimel, where the gimel and the resh are transposed, right? Kategor, kitareg. That doesn't happen very often in Semitic roots, but it can happen with Greek roots, and is developed through metathesis. If you want to know what metathesis is, you can click here and learn that I don't know. Somebody can remind me what metathesis is, some literary device. In modern Hebrew, neither is widely used, neither Praklit, Sanegor, nor Kategor. And instead, we find the verb, both verb and noun, tovea, which means to prosecute or a prosecutor. Klein's etymology is from the Greek kategoros, the accuser, literally one who speaks against somebody before an assembly, from the root words kata, meaning against in Greek, and the stem of agorein, to harangue or assert, literally to speak in the assembly, from agora, assembly. Some of you may know agoraphobia, fear of assemblies, right? The assembly or even the marketplace. We saw other words related to agora in the past. In the post about Sanegor, kata, meaning down or against, appears in such English words as catapult, catastrophe, and catalog. If the word Kategor seems to you like the English word category and the modern Hebrew word categoria, this is no coincidence. According to the online etymology dictionary entry for category, the original sense of accuse weakened to assert or name by the time Aristotle applied categoria to his 10 classes of things that can be named. So if you can assert something or name something, you are engaging in a categorization from the same root as what originally meant in a legal context, the accuser. In ancient Greek, a possible path of development, in ancient Greek, kategorein or kategorein is a concept of legal terminology, meaning the reading of a list of accusations performed in the process of charging someone. And Horowitz has a note about the word kategor. This word is clipped, or rather shortened, in the common legal idiom from kara tagar, which means to call the prosecutor. So that's very interesting. Kara is a biblical Semitic root, and tagar is another root here. I think that this is a folk etymology that is trying to anachronistically take a word that came into the Hebrew from the Greek and then presuppose that it actually has a biblical Hebrew origin, which it does not. And the author here agrees. I at first found this rather far-fetched, but there might be a connection between Kategor and the development of the phrase kara tagar, even if the individual words are not etymologically linked. If anyone knows about this, please post in the comments. And so, what do you think of all of this? Kategor, Praklit, all of these legal terms that have to do with performing a mitzvah or committing a transgression, which, as Russell points out, is not just good deed, bad deed, right? It's law and violation of law. Would it be helpful to bring the original text back on screen at this point? Then let us. Okay, let's see. Sharing my screen. Okay, so you perform a mitzvah, you get a praklit, you commit a transgression, you get a kategor. Repentance and good deeds are a shield against punishment, where the word for repentance and good deeds is teshuvah u'ma'asim tovim, kitris bifnei hapuranut. They mitigate or shield you from punishment. And Rabbi Yochanan Hassandlar said, every assembly which is for the sake of heaven, which is usually a stand-in for God, will in the end endure. And every assembly which is not for the sake of heaven will not endure in the end. Alan, what are your thoughts on all of this?
You know, I don't know if I have a command of the language to expand upon it, but to Reader's Digest this, it has to do with reputation, because reputation follows you no matter what, how good or bad you are, you still have a reputation. We had a governor of this state not long ago who was really good at what he did, we think, but then his reputation is now tagged to him, and it doesn't matter how good he did things in the past.
I want everybody to hold in your memory bank what Alan has just said, because it could not be a better lead in to the next several Mishnayot, which I think we'll have time for today. Thank you, Alan. We'll come back to you for sure. We'll come back to your wise and insightful perspective. Any other thoughts here? What about this business about repentance and good deeds are a shield against punishment? I would argue here only that this is consistent with my view that this has to do with the court at the end of life. Even though it is not said, the term olam haba, curiously, is not referenced directly here, but it seems to me that this is all about the rabbinic calculus of accumulating mitzvot and diminishing your transgressions, because at the end of the day, there's going to be a court trial, and your good deeds will speak for themselves, as will your bad deeds. Audrey, and then Judy, please.
Well, isn't this the whole point of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? And it leads up to the end in the book of life, and you will be judged. So
yeah, I think it's entirely consistent with and evocative of everything that we read and pray about on the high holy days. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Judy Gross, your hand was up. Now it's down.
There's noise out there. To me, part of this is the conflict between the spiritual and the everyday. The excuses for not studying Torah, because there are temptations. Those are the daily excuses, but it's the conflict and the reward, what you have to do to be rewarded in the end is to do what you have to do at Yom Kippur. You have to, you're in front of the ultimate judge, and you have to repent and try to repair the bad temptations that you've done as you've not been paying attention to Torah. So just
great. Thank you.
Not a great explanation, not clear.
No, really helpful. And then we have this nice comment by Yochanan Hassandlar, John the sandal maker, probably that's what he did as his esek, his day-to-day business, as opposed to la asok b'divrei Torah, his Torah business. He had a trade, though there's another comment that says, no, Hassandlar means he comes from Alexandria. I don't buy it. Hassandlar is very clearly the sandal maker. He is the one who says, any assembly that is for the sake of heaven will endure. Any assembly that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. I don't know about you, but since I am on the payroll of a Beit Knesset, literally a house of assembly, where the entire function of a synagogue is to bring a Jewish community together, I will tell you from my personal experience, as well as the anecdotal experience of so many other people who have toiled in the vineyard of congregational service, that you want to be part of a congregation that at the end of the day is gathering for a holy purpose, and that understands that its mission is to express, explore, and increase sanctity in the world, Jewish sanctity in the world. And there are some synagogues that I think do that very well and that have happened to last. And the synagogues that tend to crumble are often the ones that are sucked into petty infighting and have lost their sense of mission and purpose. They've lost their North Star, which needs to be that at the end of the day, this has to be about how do we bring God or godliness into our lives and out from there into the life of the Jewish community, out into the world. That's just my view. that a synagogue needs to understand why people are gathering, why we assemble in the first place. It's not just to have a good time. It's not for the purpose of entertainment. You want the music to be good. It's not because, you want to hear a good sermon. It has to be because you're in the business of transforming lives toward Kedusha. And synagogues that lose that either disintegrate or just, in my view, they won't be that long for the world. That's my view. Arlene?
Yeah, Jonathan, I'm wondering whether you're thinking of Park Avenue Synagogue.
Say more.
Some of the and some of the issues that have come
Park
there.
East, by the way.
Park East, yeah, which was very painful to read about.
Yeah.
It really was. It's not something to be proud of as a Jew.
No, many of you have read about a very, and it's sorted the way it's being reported. I don't have an inside scoop at all, but a very venerated 90-year-old senior rabbi. The intrigue concerns a venerated 90-year-old senior rabbi, his board or the board of the congregation, and a real rising star young associate rabbi who's been there for 8 years or so and who has attracted quite a following of people in the congregation, and conflict over what is the vision and direction of the synagogue. And all of a sudden, next thing you hear, the young rabbi is out. And it's been covered extensively in the press. I don't have to recap it here because you can read all about it. This is a matter of public record, which, one, just my protective instinct is that these things would not be, fodder for mass consumption, but sometimes they are. And I think, Arlene, you're right to express that it is sad. It is sad when congregations are riven by assemblies that are not for a holy purpose. Thank you. Okay, let us proceed. So we go on from there to the next Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Shamua, this fellow, as we can see, studied under several teachers. He's also from the same generation as the several preceding names in the Pirkei Avot. Eventually became a devoted student of Rabbi Akiva. You see how incredibly influential Akiva was and remains in rabbinic literature. He stayed with him even when the latter was awaiting execution. We've said many times that Akiva was one of the 10 martyrs persecuted and eventually executed by Rome. He then left Palestine, returning to set up an academy in the Galilee. Among his students was, which I would have thought is part of Palestine, by the way, so I'm a little bit confused by that comment, but be that as it may. Among his students was the future Nasi, or prince, or president of the entire Rabbinic Academy, Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda HaNasi is credited with being the one to compile the Mishnah. So Yehuda HaNasi's big project is this massive text that we are reading. Though Rabbi Eliezer was reputed to have lived to the age of 105, he too was eventually executed by the Romans. Unhappy ending. Eliezer ben Shamua, what did he say? He said, "Let the honor of your student be as dear to you as your own." Lovely Hebrew. Yehi chvod talmidcha chaviv alecha keshelcha. Let the kavod, there's that word that many of us are familiar with, kol hakavod, let all honor be to you. Let the honor of your talmid, the one whom you teach, your student, be chaviv, like habibi. It's a Hebrew and Arabic term of affection. Beloved unto you, keshelcha, as your own honor. Uchvod chavercha k'mora rabbecha, and let the honor of your colleague, your chaver, be as dear to you as the reverence you have for your teacher, rabbecha, your rav. Mora is not mora, teacher. This is mora with an aleph on the end, which means reverence or awe. So the awe or reverence you have for your teacher should describe that which you have for your colleague. And finally, umora rabcha, and the reverence you have for your rabbi, your teacher, k'mora shamayim, as great as the reverence as you have for God. Here, idiomatically translated as heaven, heaven always meaning God. Michelle Braun.
So at the end of the day, these are all people, all humans. And we have our, irritants and people who irritate us and people we appreciate. And we have a Beit Din of 3 people, one of whom is not allowed to lord it over the other 2 to force a judgment, but in fact to be collegial. And you need to extend that to your students, to your colleagues, to all the others in your community.
Beautiful.
At least to try.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Love that. Other thoughts on this lovely text? I can only hope to live up to it myself. I really do. I love studying Torah, but I love teaching more. And the reason is because when I teach, I'm surrounded with students who become my teachers. Truly. Truly. In fact, when I was Meshuggah, a young rabbi, I used to teach a class at WRT regularly, once midday and again in the evening. I've long since lost the koach, the stamina to do that kind of thing, but with the rest of my schedule as well. That's when I was an associate rabbi and could while away my hours teaching Torah. In any case, I would find the evening sessions to be really exciting because I could share not only what I had planned to bring to the class, but also, oh, and by the way, somebody in the afternoon class understood this passage in the following way. And it was just so delightful for me to be the conduit through which the learning that I had acquired from my students could be used to teach more students. So I want you to know, I say this with heartfelt sincerity, how much I appreciate, cherish, and revere the opportunity to learn with you for sure, but also from you. So thank you. And of course, there has never been a moment in my work as a teacher of Torah, especially here at WRT, where I have not felt embraced and respected and more from this wonderful community. So thank you. Thank you. This is like, I think we're doing what the text tells us to do, and I'm grateful for it. Judy.
Just to remember, thinking of the king and I, if you become a teacher, by your pupils, you'll be taught. And just to think of that in the.
So lovely. And what a great use of literary chiasmus. Look that one up. Yeah, it's a great term. It's when you say something one way and then you invert it for the second half of the phrase.
And I think this even talks about colleagues. And I, as a teacher with great colleagues, and I said this to Maya when she was looking for a job, just get something where you respect the people around you, because that's the beauty of really getting such pleasure out of what your occupation is. It's not only doing your occupation, but getting the input from those who are around you. And certainly as a teacher, students are the best teachers.
Thank you. And yes, you are a teacher and also a student, and you understand intimately with the stuff of your life how the two are interwoven. Grateful for your presence and your teaching. Okay, so as we continue to look ahead, because all of these are fairly simple and straightforward and just so good, but they don't require quite the same teasing out that we may have applied to other previous Mishnayot. Rabbi Judah said, and this is, I believe, Judah Hanasi, let's see if that's the one. Yehuda, yeah, was one of the most prolific scholars of the Mishnaic period, cited almost 3,000 times in Tannaitic literature, meaning early Mishnaic, the first generations of rabbinic literature. He had several teachers, but was likely closest to Rabbi Tarfon. Due to his conciliatory attitude toward the Romans, they decreed that he speak first at rabbinic convocations. Oh, this is Yehuda ben Eli, not Yehuda Hanasi. This Yehuda enjoyed good relations with the secular power. Here's what he said. Be careful in study. Heve zahir batalmud. Be careful when you study, for an error in study counts as a deliberate sin. Rabbi Shimon said there are 3 crowns. It's as if, okay, it's like that sentence is stated and then nothing more is said about it. And I really am not sure that it connects in any meaningful way to the next text. It's almost as if it seems to me that the framer or the editors here, the redactors, decided it was too short to stand on its own and doesn't really belong to what came before it or what came after it, but it's important for the students to know, so we're going to put it in there. That's the best I can offer you on this one. If you have a dissenting view, I welcome it. But I'll continue with the much more famous and appealing statement, at least so far as my opinion is concerned. Rabbi Shimon, who said, there are 3 crowns. Okay, Alan Markowitz, looking right at you on this one because you set us up for this. There are 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. And you can see Shalosha Chetarim Heim. There are 3 keters or crowns: Keter Torah, v'Keter Kihuna, the crown of being a Kohen or a priest, v'Keter Malchut, and the crown of royalty or kingship. V'Keter Shem Tov, but the crown of a good name, Ole al Gabehen, literally rises over the back of all of them, or supersedes them all. Excels them all is sometimes a translation. So there are 3 crowns: Torah, priesthood, royalty, but the crown of a good name excels them all. Judy Gross, thank you. In your edition of Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Judah's statement is given its own Mishnah. Great. That really helps. That corroborates my point of view that it doesn't really fit, but the rabbis saw fit to include it somehow and somewhere. So Alan, there you are. The crown of a good name is even greater in Pirkei Avot and in Jewish tradition than the accomplishments that come from Torah learning, from being a priest and serving the community as a priest, or as part of the hereditary priesthood, which was a kind of a birthright honor, and even the crown of being the king himself. My dad has a comment, and there's also a nice comment from Michelle Braun in the chat window. Errors don't undermine the good name. Yeah, maybe there's a connecting point there. Like, you really have to be careful in your Torah learning, because if you commit a deliberate error in your understanding, or especially in how you teach it, you have incurred something that has the same weight as a deliberate sin. And by the way, quite likely have tarnished your reputation. So maybe a connection, a stretch, but I'll give it. Dad, why don't you speak up here?
Is the first part of this maybe an admonition against deliberately misinterpreting or misteaching Torah for other reasons?
Well, I would say yes, except for the fact that it presents the idea of doing it accidentally as the same as doing it deliberately.
Where does it say accidentally?
Sorry, I'll show you. The word error implies something that you do by accident. It's the Hebrew. You don't get it from the English. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Hevei Zahir baTalmud. That's straightforward. Be careful. Be punctilious in your study of Torah. Shigagat. That's the word. A shgaga. Shgaga. It's used in the High Holiday Machzor when we talk about al chet shechatanu lefanecha, right? For the sin we have committed against you. The first one is bizadon ubishgaga. Bizadon means by scheming or premeditating. Uvishgaga, its analogue, its opposite, is by accident. So shigigat or shigagat Talmud, an unforced error in your learning, olazadon, is imputed as if it were premeditated. And there's the word zadon, which is the analogue or the antonym of shgaga. So that's why I say that it's deliberately contrasting an error made by accident as if it were intentional. Does that clarify why I'm answering your question the way I am?
Yes, but it's not fair.
Okay, I agree. Yep. I agree, and I would hate to be, I don't really like Rabbi Judah's Bar Eli's teaching here. It's not fair, come on. Like, and we've all done this, we've all made like Rosanna Dana. right? Isn't she the one who's always misinterpreting what she thought she heard?
Never mind.
Right, never mind, right? She said, what's all this I hear about? And then I'm trying to remember any of her hysterical, the late and brilliant Gilda Radner, Zichrona Livracha. Somebody can find a Rosanna Dana for me.
Something about jewelry and jewelry.
Right. Well, that was one. Like, how many of my classmates and I, when we were elementary school kids in Hebrew school, were looking at each other and said, why are they teaching us about Soviet jewelry? Who cares? Like, that was a thing for us. What's all this I hear about? Like, really? Oh, Soviet jewelry. I see. The one that comes to mind was when I was at Interlochen, the National Music Camp as a kid, as an adolescent. They had this thing that was called required recreation or required rec, but all the kids called it forced fun. But my buddy, when they said, oh, we have forced fun on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my buddy was convinced that the counselors had told us that every Tuesday and Thursday we would be out in a forest for forest fun. And some other Jewish kid who had grown up with the JNF Pushkis in his Hebrew school said, no, it must be forest fund. So this is how things, right? Every Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to pass around the JNF collection box for the forest fund. No, it meant that for 2 hours, even though you're a nerdy music kid, you have to run around and throw a Frisbee or a soccer ball. It was at Interlochen the least favorite hours of the week. Okay, anyway, but I digress. So yeah, all right, shall we proceed? Let us. I'd like to do at least one more. Anyway, this business about the reputation in Jewish tradition, I would say more, except Alan said it so beautifully earlier, that here he simply gets the awaited pat on the back that I promised him was coming. Okay, so as we proceed through at least one or two more Mishnayot, Rabbi Nehorai said, go as a voluntary exile to a place of Torah and say not that it will come after you, for it is your fellow students who will make it permanent in your hand, and lean not upon your own understanding. So after all of these very clear, very transparent Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot, we hit one that is really opaque. Rabbi Nehorai, this fellow here, he may be a second name for one of the other scholars. Many citations use this name. Most of his citations are homiletic, and some of them come in the context of his discussions with the prophet Eliyahu. Well, that's nice to know, but it doesn't really help us understand his teaching. Go as an exile, and I'll read the Hebrew too. Heve goleh limakom Torah. Go out as an exile into galut. Galut or golus is diaspora in Jewish tradition. So go as an exile limkom Torah, to a place of Torah. Ve'al tomar shehi tavo acharecha. If you go out as an exile to a place of Torah, do not say that it will come after you. She chaverecha yikaimuha biyadecha. Yikayamuha biyadecha. Very, very strange phrase here. It is your chaverim, your colleagues, your fellow students, who will make it, presumably the antecedent is Torah, permanent in your hand, whatever that may mean. It will make Torah stick, right? Ve'el binatrecha al tisa'en, tisha'en rather. A quote from Proverbs chapter 3. Lean not upon your own understanding. What the heck is this Mishnah all about? Anyone want to just kind of work with me to unpack it all? Ivan, a hand, I see it. Yeah.
Well, what really comes to mind here is that it's almost like spreading the word is another way of saying it, but there is so much learnedness, and there were so many heathens, presumably at the time, that would benefit from your giving up the good things that you have as a rabbi or as a wise man debating, discussing with your colleagues, and go out voluntarily, and here is the point, voluntarily to spread the word. I think this is something that was adopted by, Paul and other Christian or other religions' edicts. But it comes to mind that you have a community of thousands, and then there are communities of tens of thousands who never heard about what it is about.
That's great. And thank you. You've set me up for what I wanted to say. And the reason I wanted to hit this Mishnah before we conclude in just a moment is because this is the last Mishnah we will learn together before I take the second half of my study sabbatical, which has been spread out over 2 winters. A couple of things are advised in this Mishnah. The first is that if you truly want Torah to stick, you actually have to go out from where you have been. You have to seek out perhaps even unfamiliar people and communities, either there to teach, as Ivan suggests, or there to learn. That if you really want Torah to be internalized, you can't just sit at home by yourself and even perhaps in the same bubble, the same consistent milieu, the same group of people. You've got to put yourself in a state of exile and then experience Torah. The other thing it says that's really important for me, and I'm using this as a little bit of like, I'm listening to this Mishnah as it guides me in what I hope to experience over the next few months, as I did last winter, which is that Torah is not to be learned alone, that this is a community enterprise. And I am really looking forward in ways that I was not really able because of the COVID situation to experience this year what I couldn't last year, which is a little bit of travel. So I will be in Southern California for the entire month of January. For the first time in 2 years since pre-COVID, I will be able to participate with a group of 40 rabbis and cantors in-person learning, study, meditation, yoga, spirituality retreat through the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. So that's one way I plan to go into exile to deepen my Torah with other people who will help reinforce it for me. I also have the opportunity to learn with colleagues whom I rarely get to see up close and personal, including Rabbi Ken Chasen. I may be able to offer a Devar Torah in the congregation of my illustrious predecessor, who was the associate rabbi at WRT from 1998 to 2003. And my dear colleague, Alexis Burke, who is the rabbi of Solel, the temple in Cardiff by the Sea, just north of San Diego, as well as a number of others. I have a number of colleagues that I am hoping to interact with, learn Torah from, study with. And I would, if you can as well over these winter months, starting with learning with Rabbi Reeser, learning with a different rabbi if you've never studied with him, I would highly advise, don't take my advice, take the advice of Pirkei Avot, which says that you've got to stretch yourself outside your comfort zone and learn with new people too. And of course, each other. I hope you will continue to be amazing students, colleagues, partners, and classmates to and with one another. You have given me so much over these past almost 2 years of studying Mishnah together. We will continue when I am back. Russell, I want to acknowledge your hand before I say one last comment, and then it's time to go.
Well, I didn't mean to. I mean, yours was such a beautiful closing. I didn't mean to steal your last word.
Not at all.
But I interpreted "go into exile" with the Torah meaning to be bold. Go someplace very far away, someplace where you're very uncomfortable, and in doing so, you'll take people with you. So I hope that you will be bold in your journey.
I really appreciate that. And I want to show you something that I left in the other room. If you'll stay online with me for one more minute, okay? Bear with me.
The teacher's gone, no spitballs.
So, all right, can you hear me? I'm back. Okay, good. What I'm showing you is a saying. It's written in English characters, but it's from Sanskrit. And it was a gift on a water bottle. I don't know if you can read it, but it says Nivar Tattvam. Nivar Tatvam. I received this as a little souvenir from a meditation retreat that I participated in just a little over a month ago. One of the most celebrated and also maligned and misunderstood speeches by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He gets up in front of, an assembled group of thousands of people who've come to hear him impart great wisdom, and he would often expatiate for hours. And at this one speech, he only said 2 words, and then he walked off the stage. He said, Nivar Tatvam. And nobody exactly knows what they mean, but the best possible translation of these words from the Sanskrit is go where you are not, or transcend yourself. And I think that there's a wonderful harmony between Nivar Tatvam and the Mishnah that we have just read in the name of Rabbi Nehorai. Maybe Russell said it, be bold, right? Go beyond yourself to find Torah. So those are my last words to you today, my faithful students, disciples, friends, classmates, and teachers. Nivar Tatvam, go beyond yourselves and continue to deepen your Torah. And I can't wait to see in which both of us, all of you and I, will have new Torah to share and explore together when I'm back. We will resume exactly where we left off. This class will be uploaded to the interweb, and I look forward to staying in touch. Be well, my friends. Shalom.
Kol Shalom.
Well, enjoy.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, and we'll miss you.
Miss you too.
Namaste.
Thanks. Thanks, friends.
Have
Bye
an enlightened sabbatical.
Thank you. I intend to. Be well. Thank you.
Suck the marrow
Thank
from
you.
the bone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.